I know we have a few more people who are still signing in, but those of you who got here early, we need to get started so that, we can reward that promptness. This is the fourth of our Star Lecture series for the year. How many among us have been to all four so far? Wow, that is really, really cool. So those people know all about our drawing this year. We're going to be doing something very special for our people who go to 7 out of 7 and our people who go to 6 out of 6. But we've decided this crowd is just too good. We're going to have to come up with some other special things for those of you who come to the rest of the Star Lectures. Remember, this is the last Star Lecture for the semester, and then we'll pick up in January with Dr. Marty Raymonds from the School of Nursing, who'll be talking about Poverty Makes Me Ill. So we'll be moving our focus to looking at healthcare. In February, Dr. Valerie Polacco from the College of Ed will be looking at that intersection between poverty, women and gender issues, and childhood poverty. And she's going to do an amazing job. And then our last one will be in March, and that's with Dr. Lynn Nivell from the School of Social Work. And she's going to be really challenging us to think about, so what does it matter? Why are we not doing more about this? And so she'll be introducing some ways of thinking about that. Just a couple of housekeeping things before I introduce our speaker tonight. I know you're all looking forward to Dr. Higgins. I know I am. He did a Star Lecture for us last year, and it's very, very atypical for us to have a speaker 2 years in a row. But people were so captivated with his talk last year that I had lots of requests. And when I asked him again, he looked stunned and said, sure. So that's great. We're going to have that in just a couple of minutes. I did want you to know, those of you who are honors students, if anyone does not have a ticket for Catching Fire and wants one, you'll need to secure that the next few days. We have some seats left open, and we're going to open up that field trip, that outing, to the rest of the campus. And so all the tickets will be gone very quickly after we open that up. We're going to be renting a theater on Carpenter Road. We have a premiere showing of Catching Fire. For those of you who are not in the know, that's the second in the series of the Hunger Games. And we're going to be leaving campus together, going to the theater. It will be really cool. So a $10 ticket will take care of all of your expenses, and the Honors College is providing all the concessions. So that's that. A couple of other things. Those of you who are in the Honors College have enjoyed priority registration. Raise your hand if you registered for winter classes today. Okay, so if you're not in the Honors College and you are at all interested about what that means and what the benefits of that might be, or the scholarships available in the Honors College, I invite you to give me a call or send an email or come over to the Honors College any day after this week. Because this week we are really caught up in registering honors students for the winter semester. But you can reach me with questions about tonight, or questions about the series, or questions about any honors activity, or getting into the Honors College at rebecca.sipe@uh.edu, or go on the website for the Honors College. That said, it is such a privilege tonight to welcome Peter Higgins back. Professor Higgins is an assistant professor in the Department of History and Philosophy. His talk tonight is going to deal with issues related to absolute poverty. He writes that absolute poverty causes the death of 18 million people each year. It's a staggering number. 50,000 people a day die because of poverty, absolute poverty. He says that that accounts for approximately 1/3 of all the human deaths in a year. It's no exaggeration to say that global poverty is the most significant source of human suffering in the world today. And yet most Americans who live in a country in which absolute poverty does not occur do not seem to regard severe global poverty as a pressing moral issue. And tonight he's going to press on the question, why is that? And look at the ethical implications of that. Dr. Higgins did his undergraduate work at the University of Kansas in philosophy. He has a master's in philosophy from the University of Colorado at Boulder, as well as his PhD from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He has been a really aggressive scholar. He has done many different publications and talks already in his career. His areas of specialization include contemporary political and social philosophy and feminist philosophy, and he also teaches in the area of ethics, philosophy of law, environmental philosophy, and ancient Greek philosophy. In the winter, for those of you who have not signed up for classes yet, or those of you who still have a trading card that you might want to pull out, he'll be doing a class in feminist philosophy for the Honors College, also a class in political philosophy and a class in ethics. Before Dr. Higgins begins, I just want to take a moment to say we all love technology, and if you have technology in your hand to take notes, that's a good thing. Take all the notes that you want. I'll be doing that too. If you have technology in your hand that's anything else, especially anything that might buzz or zing or like play, you know, the Saints go marching in the middle of a talk, it'd be a really good moment to turn that off and put it away. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Peter Higgins to the podium. While he's coming up, I'll just mention, he also has a handout for those of you who need a signature on something. At the end, I'll just be giving you my autograph right on these, but I'll be passing these out in a second.
All right. I'm going to try this microphone. How well can you hear me? Should I move this up? Yeah. How about now? Better? I can always talk into this too. Okay, we might just do that. Okay. Well, I never trust technology really, and I hope you all will feel especially honored because I made the very first PowerPoint ever for you. So keep in mind that it's my first attempt. It's not super fancy. I don't know how to put pictures and things, but it will help you follow the talk, I think, pretty well. Thank you so much for coming to the talk this evening. I'm a little bit sad, but only a little bit, to tell you that the effect of my talk may be to cause you to leave this evening feeling somewhat depressed. But that's actually, in a way, a good thing. You see, given the state of the world today, which is characterized by systemic injustices, if you didn't leave the talk tonight feeling a little bit depressed or a little bit upset, I would be worried that there's something wrong with you. Maybe you haven't been sufficiently informed, and so I haven't done my job very well, or maybe even worse, you're a sociopath. Now, I hope there are no sociopaths in the audience because I might say something upsetting and I don't want to get myself into trouble. But if you're interested and you don't feel sufficiently depressed by the end of the evening tonight, I do encourage you to enroll in my classes because I like to teach about these really depressing things as a regular basis of my course offerings here at Eastern. Now, but seriously, folks, now that the comedy portion of the evening is over, that's as good as it's going to get, I want to introduce you to some thought experiments. You see, in philosophy, which is my discipline, we like to make use of thought experiments in order to gain greater clarity about the moral intuitions that we have. And I want to start with a thought experiment. None of these, by the way, are my own invention. The case of Alice. Now, if you can't read, I will be reading these for you. Some of these slides with the thought experiments have a bit more writing on them than the others. All right. On her way to work, Alice passes a shallow pond where children sometimes play. It's only about knee-deep. She sees a small child splashing in the pond by himself and no adults nearby supervising him. As she gets closer, she realizes that he's not playing in the pond, but rather appears to be drowning. She has only a moment to decide what to do. Alice can wade into the pond and save the child, but that would cause her to ruin her shoes, and it might even make her late to work. On the other hand, the child will almost certainly die if Alice does not help him. And so I'd like to pose a question to you all. Does Alice have a moral obligation to wade into the pond and save the child? Raise your hand if you think Alice does indeed have a moral obligation to wade into the pond and save the child. Good, it looks like lots of people, and that means you're on my side, so in case I do upset you tonight, I don't have to worry too much about being attacked. Okay. Let me show you another thought experiment. This one's really hard to read, so follow my voice, not the screen. Bob is close to retirement. He has invested most of his savings in a very rare, valuable old car, a Bugatti, which he has been unable to insure. The Bugatti is his pride and joy. Not only does he get pleasure from driving it, he also knows its rising market value means that he will be able to sell it and live comfortably after retirement. One day, when Bob is out for a drive, he parks the Bugatti near the end of a railway siding and goes for a walk up the track. As he does so, he sees that a runaway train with no one aboard is rolling down the track. Looking further down, he sees a child who appears to be absorbed in playing on the tracks. Oblivious to the runaway train, the child is in great danger. Bob can't stop the train, and the child is too far away to hear his warning shout. But Bob can throw a switch that will divert the train down the siding where his Bugatti is parked. If he does so, no one will be killed, but the train will crash through the decaying barrier at the end of the siding and destroy his Bugatti. Thinking of his joy in owning the car and the financial security it represents, Bob decides not to throw the switch. So once again, I'd like to ask you a question. Has Bob acted wrongly in choosing to preserve his Bugatti over the risk of the death of the child? Raise your hand if you think Bob has acted wrongly. All right, still quite a few people. Good, we're on the right track. You're playing right into my hands, by the way. Thank you for that. And the third case, Carl. Carl is driving his vintage sedan down a country lane when he is stopped by a hiker who has seriously injured her leg. She asks Carl to take her to the nearest hospital. If Carl refuses, it is very likely that she will lose her leg. On the other hand, if Carl agrees to take her to the hospital, there is still a small chance she will lose her leg. Moreover, it is likely to bleed onto the seats, which Carl has recently and quite expensively restored in soft white leather. And thus we ask, does Carl have a moral obligation to take the hiker to the hospital? Raise your hand if you think yes. Okay, good. A similarly high number of you. I can't quite tell if everyone, but it looks like the vast majority of you think that Carl, like Alice, like Bob, has a moral obligation to save the person who's in danger despite the potential for some cost to themselves. And moreover, notice about these latter two situations as well, that there's some uncertainty about the outcome. There's no guarantee, for example, in the case of Carl, that he will be able to save the hiker's leg. And in the case of Bob, he doesn't know that perhaps at the last minute the child won't jump out of the way, finally noticing the train coming directly his way. Now, these are cases that the philosopher Peter Singer uses in order to establish a certain general moral principle, a principle that I've called here the principle of beneficence. The principle is this: if it's in your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important, it is wrong not to do so. Singer takes this principle to be evidenced by our intuitive reactions to the cases that we have just looked at. In other words, he says, the fact that we almost all think that Alice, Bob, and Carl have an obligation to rescue the person in danger, despite uncertainty of the outcome, despite the fact that there's some personal cost involved, is evidence for, and furthermore is the best explanation of the fact that we accept this more general, deeper moral principle, the principle of beneficence. Again, if it's in your power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything nearly as important, it's wrong not to do so. But now I'd like you to consider a fourth case. This is the case of Diane. Millions of children under the age of 5 die from poverty-related causes every year. They die from easily preventable, treatable conditions like measles, dehydration, malnutrition, and smallpox. Treatments and preventions capable of saving the life of one of these children cost less than $10. Organizations like Oxfam have deployed staff throughout the world to treat and prevent these life-threatening conditions. They are effective in doing so, but are limited in how many children they can save due to lack of funding. Individuals may donate privately and securely through their website, oxfam.org, with a bank account or a credit card number. Diane is considering going to the movies with her friends. Between the cost of the ticket, popcorn, and soda, she will spend $20. If Diane donated that same amount to Oxfam, she would save the lives of 2 children in Africa. And so I ask, does Diane have a moral duty to donate her $20 to Oxfam rather than go to the movies? Now, raise your hand again if you think indeed Diane has this obligation. All right, I'm noticing a big difference this time around. There are a few of you, indeed, who seem to think Diane has a moral obligation to give her $20 to Oxfam rather than go to the movies with it. But significantly less. I was sensing about 90% approval in the first 3 cases at least, and maybe only about 10% of you this time around. So this raises the question, why do we seem to think intuitively that Diane lacks a moral obligation that Alice, Bob, and Carl each have? In the morally salient respects, the case of Diane seems analogous to the cases of Alice, Bob, and Carl. Now, we might suggest psychological reasons, psychological explanations of why we morally assess the case of Diane in a way that departs from our assessments of the cases of Alice, Bob, and Carl. For example, most of us are rarely in situations quite like those of Alice, Bob, and Carl. After all, how often do you find yourself in a situation where you've driven your $100,000 car and parked it at the end of a railway track? Only to find a small child oblivious to the oncoming train playing on the other track. However, what's different about these cases, one difference, is we daily find ourselves in situations just like Diane's. You all are considering right now whether or not to go to Catching Fire and spend $10 on a ticket. This is a type of situation that we find ourselves faced with every single day. Thus, were we to say that Diane acts wrongly by going to the movies rather than donating the money she spends and doing so to Oxfam, then we would have to accept that we ourselves act wrongly as Alice would by failing to save the drowning child, on a routine basis. That is, every time we spend money on things that are morally insignificant. Now, most people find the guilt that typically accompanies a sense that they have failed in their moral duties painful. And so we have a psychological incentive to believe quite firmly that Diane has no moral obligation to send her $20 to Oxfam. In other words, we have a psychological incentive to reason for self-interest on this case, because it makes us feel better about our own actions and thus escapes the guilt we might feel should we actually come to accept that we've acted wrongly in some way. Now, I think this is interesting, but I'm not a psychologist, I'm a philosopher, and so really what I want to talk about is another type of question. Another way of answering the question, why is our intuitive reaction in the case of Diane different? Specifically, as a philosopher, I want to focus on whether or not our reasons for giving a divergent moral assessment in the case of Diane, different from the moral assessment we gave in the case of Alice, Bob, and Carl, can be rationally justified. And in fact, I want to ask an even more general question than this. Do residents of the world's wealthiest countries, such as the US, act wrongly by doing far less than they could to alleviate severe poverty globally? That's the central question of this talk. Now, one thing that I find in giving talks or in teaching classes is that people really like facts and statistics. And so I'm going to give you what I know you all crave in the next section of this talk, namely Some facts about global poverty. Dr. Seid mentioned some of these in her introduction, but one of them includes, and perhaps the most stark, is that 2.5 billion people, that's nearly 40% of humankind, live in severe poverty. Here's what's interesting about this, if you didn't already know. A person is counted as severely poor if she's a member of a household whose consumption expenditure per person per year has less purchasing power than $785.76 had in the United States in 1993. This is the inflation-adjusted amount based on the World Bank's original 1985 $2 per day severe poverty line. Now, think about this number. This amount, $785, this is an annual income that's represented by this figure. And so if you didn't know that already 2.5 billion people in the world today subsist on less than this amount, then your jaw should be on the floor right now. This is astounding that this higher percentage of humankind lives on this income. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and sometimes I find that people misunderstand this statistic somewhat, is that what's being talked about right now are not exchange rates. You might think, $785, that's not very much money, but I bet if I went to, say, Chad or Niger, that if I had $785 US and could convert it into their currency, that would actually be a decent amount. But that would be a mistaken understanding how this poverty line is determined. The $785, the equivalent of $2 a day, is a purchasing power rather than an exchange rate. So what they're saying when they say someone is poor is they're saying, imagine that you lived in the United States in 1993 and your annual income was $785. What would your purchasing power be? That's the poverty line. It's not the exchange rate, currency amount of $785. It's the purchasing power you would actually have in the United States in 1993 if you had this income. And so this is quite stark. It really represents an absolute level of poverty. It's something that's astounding, especially because this really doesn't even occur in countries like the United States. Even homeless people collect more spare change on a daily basis than this level of poverty represents. And so absolute poverty literally does not exist in countries like the United States. Here's what's even more startling. The average poor person in the world today falls below the severe poverty line by 41%. They're not all making $785, but most of them, they subsist on far less than this. In fact, about 950 million people live on less than half this amount. And this is what's called by the World Bank extreme poverty. So they have two classifications, severe and extreme poverty being the worst of the two. The largest number of poor people are in South Asia, followed by Africa and then East Asia. But in terms of the demographics of poverty, we find that it's more concentrated in Africa than elsewhere, because the proportion that are extremely poor in South and East Asia are demographic minorities, whereas over half the population in Africa qualifies as extremely poor. However, there's also significant poverty in places such as Latin America and the Caribbean, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Pacific Islands. One thing you might notice about all of these places where poverty occurs is that these are generally not places that have a whole lot of white people in them. And so poverty is significantly correlated in our world with race. And it's people of color in our world today who are dramatically overrepresented among the global poor. Another thing that's shocking about this, if you hadn't known already, is that globally, 70% of the world's poor are women or girls. So poverty is also a gendered phenomenon in our world, as well as being racialized. Overwhelmingly, the vast majority of poor people in the world today are either of color or women or girls. This isn't something that affects people at random, in other words. 830 million people, in terms of the effects of this extreme and severe poverty, are chronically malnourished. 1.1 billion lack access to safe drinking water. 2.6 billion lack access to basic sanitation, and 1 billion lack adequate shelter. 1.6 billion lack electricity. 2 billion lack essential drugs. 774 million are illiterate, and 218 million are child laborers. Now let me tell you something a little more generally about the effects of severe and extreme poverty. 18 million people die every year from poverty-related causes, and this accounts for 1/3 of all human deaths. This comes to, if you divide this number by 365, about 50,000 people every day. In the past 20 years, more people have died as a result of poverty than from all wars and government repression of the 20th century. In fact, as many die from poverty-related causes every 7 months as died in the Nazi death camps. 29,000 of the 50,000 who die every day from poverty-related causes are children under the age of 5, who die from chronic malnutrition and other easily treatable conditions that have long been eradicated in developed countries such as the US, including measles, malaria, and diarrhea, conditions that are almost never, if ever, fatal in wealthy countries. Let me tell you something too, not just about poverty, but also about economic inequality, which is a distinct concept. The 2.5 billion poor, that is, again, almost 40% of the human population, they account for 1.67% of global household consumption expenditures, 40% subsisting on 1.67% of the world's wealth. In contrast, the 1 billion residents of high-income countries, the US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, they account for about 81% of household consumption expenditures globally. Now, those 1 billion represent about 15% of the human population. So you have 15% living on 81% of the world's wealth, and 40% living on less than 2% of it. Inequality is so stark in our world today, this is another really astounding fact, I'd say, that if you were to take just 1/70th of the wealth of the residents of the world's high-income countries, 1/70th, that's about 1.4%, and you shifted it from the wealthy to the poor, that would totally eradicate severe and extreme poverty in the world today. That's how unequal our world is. You could bring everyone above the severe poverty line just by shifting 1.4% of the wealth of people who live in the world's high-income countries. What's unfortunate, though, is that it turns out this inequality is actually increasing. The gap between the world's wealthiest fifth and poorest, in 1820 it was 3-to-1. By 1960 it was 30-to-1. And in the most recent estimation of this in 1997, it was 74-to-1. You can clearly see a trend here. We often like to think of the world as characterized by moral progress, that things are always getting better. We overcome injustice, we realize the errors of our ways in the past, and we make things more just. This is a narrative we like to think of the world in terms of, but it turns out, at least in respect to global poverty, which, as I've said, is correlated with race and gender, things are not getting better, they're getting worse. But even now, during times of so-called economic crisis, Americans are markedly better off than those who live in extreme poverty. In the United States, 97% of the people who are classified as poor by the US Census Bureau own a colored television. 3/4 own a car, the same amount have air conditioning and a DVD player or a VCR. All have access at least to emergency room health care. Life expectancy in rich countries is 78, while in poor countries it's below 50. Fewer than 1 in 100 children die before 5 in rich countries, but 20% of them die in poor countries. What I'm emphasizing here is that there is certainly poverty in countries like the United States, countries of Western Europe, but it's not absolute poverty, it's relative poverty. That is to say, it's economic inequality. But the poor in countries like the United States, their basic needs are met in a way such that they don't suffer absolute poverty. They're doing much worse than other members of their own society. You might think there's a special kind of injustice in that. But they're not absolutely poor. They're poor only in a relative sense, that is, relative to their compatriots. Now, given all these facts, I think it's uncontroversial to say that absolute poverty is the single greatest source of human suffering in the world today. It would be hard to think of any other single cause that could account for more suffering than poverty. But this takes us back to the question I asked before, which I said would be the central question of this talk. Do residents of the world's wealthiest countries, such as the United States, act wrongly by doing far less than they could to alleviate severe poverty around the world? Now, according to Singer, who I mentioned earlier, the answer emphatically is yes. It's quite morally terrible that we could shift 1/70th of our wealth to the poor and completely eradicate severe poverty. That is, make a very minor sacrifice on our own part, much like Alice might, should she wade into the pond, ruining her shoes and pants and making herself late to work. Suppose Alice were unwilling to make that sacrifice in order to save the child's life. Singer thinks we're doing something that is morally analogous to this, that is morally the same. But this is not a political rally, it's a philosophy talk. And so I want to give you some reasons for this. I want to present you Singer's argument, which in many ways will be the focal point of his talk this evening. Singer's argument begins with the premise: suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Whoa, controversial, right? I don't know if we can handle this. Singer says, no one can sincerely and genuinely dispute this. It would be bizarre if anyone were to say that these things, bizarre and difficult to believe, were someone to profess the belief that this premise is not true. His second premise is something we've already seen. This is the principle of beneficence. If it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important, it is wrong not to do so. Now, we've already seen the evidence for this. It was our intuitive reaction to the cases of Alice, Bob, and Carl. And so Singer would say, just as the first premise can't sincerely be disputed, it would be disingenuous for us at this point to deny premise 2, because we already seem to agree with it by raising our hands and saying, yes, Alice, Bob, and Carl have an obligation to save the person who's in great danger, even though there's some cost to themselves. And the argument's third premise is, by donating to aid agencies, you can prevent suffering, death, and from lack of food, shelter, and medical care without sacrificing anything nearly as important. Now consider what we have here. Premises 1 and 2 together establish the following. If it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening, such as suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care, without sacrificing anything nearly as important, it is wrong not to do so. And it turns out, premise 3 tells us, that we can do precisely that. Precisely that is in our power, the prevention of suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care, without sacrificing anything morally significant of ourselves. And thus, Singer takes these premises, each of which seem quite uncontroversial in themselves, to be evidence, not merely evidence, but to deductively and logically establish The conclusion, if you do not donate to aid agencies, you are doing something wrong. Now, clearly, lots of us don't think this is true, because severe and extreme poverty persists in our world, despite our ability to do things that are morally analogous to what Alice does in rescuing the child from the shallow pond. And yet, we don't seem to be doing these things. And so we want to ask, is this something that can be morally justified? But before we do that, let's look a little further at what the implications of Singer's conclusion are. We normally think of donating to aid agencies as charity. That is to say, by calling it charity, we say it's good, it's kind, but it's not morally required. That's precisely what it means to say that it's charity. But what Singer's argument shows is that what we conventionally regard as charity is not charity at all, because it's not optional. It's morally obligatory. Look again at Singer's conclusion, which I have at the top of the slide. If you do not donate to aid agencies, you are doing something wrong. It doesn't say, if you donate to aid agencies, you're doing something really nice. It actually says you're positively doing something wrong if you fail to donate to aid agencies. And so we normally think of donating to aid agencies as charitable, but that's belied by Singer's argument, which he appears to demonstrate deductively, in a way, in other words, that it's rationally inescapable for us to accept the conclusion. He hasn't simply presented evidence for this conclusion. He's presented a deductive argument, which means that if the premises are true, and the conclusion logically follows from them, then rationally we have no choice but to accept the conclusion. But I mentioned before, and I'll say it explicitly here, what's striking about Singer's argument is that each of the premises in and of themselves, none of them seem particularly controversial. They're premises that, if you were to examine them independently of each other, you would probably assent to all of them quite readily. And the argument does indeed appear to be one in which the conclusion logically follows from the premises. That is to say, even if one were to dispute the truth of the premises, one could agree that if they were true, the conclusion would be established. But since we independently think, most of us, that the premises individually are true, we find ourselves in a situation where we accept each of the premises and yet reject the conclusion. Now this is odd. This is odd both from a psychological perspective and again from a philosophical perspective as well. And so what I want to ask at this point in the talk is, are we being irrational, or is there some flaw in Singer's argument? Is our failure to endorse the conclusion wholeheartedly and go home tonight and give Oxfam our credit card number, is that something that's simply irrational? Are we reasoning in our own self-interest somehow? Or is there some flaw in Singer's argument that could be established? Now you can see on the second page of the handout that you all have that there are several objections people often put to Singer's argument. I want to talk about one in particular, the first one on your handout. And if you all have more questions later about some of these objections, if you feel the force of them yourself, please ask me, and during the question period, I can shed a little light on how perhaps Singer might respond to those objections. But I particularly want to look at the first of these objections, because it relates to the premise in Singer's argument that we haven't yet seen a defense of. The premise that by donating to aid agencies, you can alleviate suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care without incurring some significant cost to yourself.